can start now. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the NITheCS Colloquium. My name is Francesco Petruccione, and I'm at the moment the interim director of NITheCS. Yeah? This afternoon, it is a pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Emmanuel Dufourq. Emmanuel is originally from Mauritius, but I think he studied, or at least he completed his PhD at UCT, after which he spent some time as a postdoc at Ames, and is currently a lecturer at the University of Stellenbosch and a junior research chair at Ames. So, after his PhD, Emmanuel switched his field of research to applications of machine learning in the field of ecology, and we are very curious to hear today what is going to tell us. Yeah? Just for the logistics, please make use of the Q&A facility at the bottom right of your Zoom screen to ask questions. And since we are not so many, you're also welcome to raise your hand, and we can give you the rights to speak. Yeah. Before I ask Emmanuel to start, I just wanted to extend to all of you the invitation just after this colloquium to join us for the first ever NITheCS virtual social event. Yeah, so we've never done it before, so no guarantees about the outcome. But on your web browser, the link should appear where you can join the social event on a website called Kumo Space. I think the only thing that you need to do is to sign in, to register and briefly create an account, but that takes probably 10 seconds. Yeah. So that this is the advert. Yeah. So Emmanuel, we are very happy to have you with us today. You're most than welcome to share your screen and start your presentation. So thank you very much, Emmanuel.
Thanks, Professor. Okay, there we go. Can you see my slides?
We can see them, but not yet in full screen in presentation mode. Now something is happening. Yeah, perfect.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining in on this talk. So my name is Emmanuel Dufourq, and I will start off first by thanking a number of institutions and individuals who have and who currently are still supporting various parts of my research. Stellenbosch University, the School for Data Science and Computational Thinking, the Department of Industrial Engineering, the IDRC and the Canadian government, Microsoft AI for Earth, my good friend and co-founder of EdgeAcoustics, Mark Hainan, and my postdoc advisor, Ian Durbach, who is an associate professor at UCT, and he is also currently with the University of St. Andrews. So I'll be talking about machine learning for ecology, and I will discuss a particular case study that I've been working on, and then we'll discuss some other case studies as well. Okay, so a fairly recent report by the WWF, and I literally took a screenshot. So I'll just read it because it's quite important. So it says, the evidence is unequivocal. The nature has been changed and destroyed by us at a rate unprecedented in history. The 2020 Global Living Index, Living Planet Index shows an average 68% fall in population of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, fish between 1970 and 2016. So this is an extract from the Living Planet Report 2020. If you haven't heard about this type of report before, I strongly encourage you to take a look at it. So there's no doubt that there's been a catastrophic decline in the wildlife population in recent years, and a number of species are threatened with extinction due to a number of factors such as over-exploitation, such as in the case of the tuna, for example, tuna fish, deforestation, and climate change. And we're mostly aware of these issues. But the question is, who will answer this particular SOS? And my suggested answer is that to a certain extent, perhaps we all can play a part. So I'm not here today as an activist for ecology, but as a scientist to try and share what we've been doing in this space to try and assist with conservation ecology. So briefly, I will talk about machine learning for classification tasks in ecology. And then, so we'll discuss a particular case study on the Hainan gibbon, and then discuss a little bit about what some of my students have done. And then we'll talk about machine learning for object detection tasks in ecology. And then I will give a brief overview of where I think all of this is heading and where we should be placing our efforts. Okay, so in classification, we're trying to answer questions like, is there an Egyptian goose present in the image? So these are the type of questions we're answering. So in a nutshell, for machine learning classification, the problem is about trying to classify things into different categories. So for example, classifying images, classifying audio, or classifying frames from a video. So that's the classification problem. And another type of problem that we encounter in machine learning is that of object detection. And in this case, we're saying something like, here is the location of a dog, so the one on the left. Here is the location of a dog, the one in the second one, the dog in the middle. And here is the location of a cat in this image. So classification is about presence or absence of a particular entity, and object detection is about finding the entities, multiple entities, and being able to locate the entities within an image. So object detection machine learning is about trying to determine the location of different categories within data. And these are briefly the two things that I'll be briefly discussing about what we've been doing in the space. So for machine learning classification and ecological questions, so we're trying to answer classification questions, but in the context of ecology. So for example, we could be asking the following question, does an image contain an endangered animal? And so this is fundamentally quite a simple question, because we're saying in one particular question, in one particular image, does it contain an endangered animal? And it could be an image captured from a particular camera. But now this is fairly simple, but we can scale it quite significantly. Now we can say which camera has detected an endangered species. So now we can have a spatial analysis where if, for example, we have 50 cameras set out in a particular area, we can now study the movement of a particular animal, maybe an endangered bird or something else, via answering this classification question as, is this species present in this image or not? And which camera detected the picture? And we know the coordinates of the camera, and therefore we can understand a little bit about the spatial movements of the species. We can also answer other questions like, so we're not limited to only images. We can also think about audio. So we can say, does an audio clip contain the vocalization of some endangered species? So, and we're not only limited to images or audio, we can also think about videos. So we can say, given a particular recorded video, is this species encountering enough prey? So in this case, what that would mean is if we attach a camera to a particular species. For example, if we attach a camera to a penguin, we can classify the images that are essentially in front of the penguin, since the camera is pointing in front. And then we can ask, what is the penguin encountering? Is it encountering prey that it's eating? Is it encountering jellyfish or not? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And this, just to give you a little clue about why we would do this, is we can then start to model the energy consumed and expended by the penguin by studying its movements and by studying the prey that it's encountering and determining if it's actually consuming the prey or not. So these are the type of questions in the context of ecology that we might apply machine learning for classification problems. Okay, so let's go to a case study. So I've worked on this problem for quite a long time, primarily the duration of my postdoc. And it is on the Hainan gibbon, which is the world's rarest primate. So there are about 33 individuals that remain in the Bawangling National Nature Reserve on the Hainan Island, which is just off the coast of China. And on the left is an example of a female Hainan gibbon, and on the right is an example of a male Hainan gibbon. So this species is a critically endangered species, according to the IUCN Red List. And if you haven't heard about the IUCN Red List, then at its core, it essentially is a critical indicator of the health of the world's biodiversity. And there are different levels that species can be classified at. So for example, data deficient, there's not enough data. Least concerned. So this least concerned would mean least concerned with regards to extinction. Then there's near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and then there's critically endangered. So the Hainan gibbon is classified as a critically endangered species. Okay, so we're talking about audio. So how do we record audio? So there's two, I'll say generally, there's two kind of main approaches. One is when we're actively in the area of study. So on the right is an example of a directional microphone, sometimes called a shotgun microphone. And the directional microphone is plugged into a recorder. So you can see at the bottom right, there's a recorder, and in the left hand is the directional microphone. And essentially this allows the user to point the directional microphone at the source, at the direction of the source of the sound, to get the best possible signal. And all sounds that are emitted perpendicular to this microphone are not really captured as intently as what is directly in front of the directional microphone. So this is good because we can obtain very accurate data. So why? Well, because we can actually see, right? If we are monitoring a particular bird, we can see the bird maybe, and we can point the microphone, and when the bird vocalizes, we are able to confirm that this sound was emitted from this exact species. So it allows us to capture very accurate data, but at the same time, it's extremely invasive because there's someone walking around, and if you are doing this for birds, for example, then if you get too close, then the bird might fly away because you know, you're in its space. And now there are varying levels of these microphones. Of course, they differ in price range, and some of them are more sophisticated than others. And then we can do things like attach parabolas to them to get better signals. So this is the one way of doing it, where it's very active, but very invasive. And the other way of doing this is via passive acoustic monitoring. And here we make use of devices that are continuously recording or that we can program to record. So at the bottom left is an example of an AudioMorph recorder. And if you haven't heard of an AudioMorph recorder, it's a small device. So I actually have one here. Towards the end of the talk, when I unshare my screen, I'll show it to you. It runs on 3 AA batteries and can be programmed to start recording and stop recording whenever you would like it. So here's an example of one that was tied to a tree in Cape Town when I was doing a particular survey for 2 birds. So this is an example of a passive acoustic way of monitoring. And this way of monitoring has become much more accessible than it was before, in that the price is relatively cheaper compared to more sophisticated recorders. So the one on the left is around $70, and on the one on the right can range between $400 to $800. So these AudioMorphs allow for this type of research is essentially much more accessible now, with the hardware becoming smaller and essentially more cost effective. So now that we've talked about ways of recording data, how is audio actually captured? So we have our recording device, and the data is digitally stored as a raw amplitude values. And I want you to think of a long sequence of numbers. So just a long sequence of numbers, -1, 2, 3, 0.5. And the amount of values that is recorded in 1 second of time is what we call the sampling rate. Now, we can set different sampling rates on the recorders, which essentially allows us to capture different vocalizations or different soundscape audio data. So I'll define soundscape in a bit. But so we need to think about these things in advance. So we need to think, what frequency does the species that I'm interested in vocalize at? And then I need to set the sampling rate of my recorder in a corresponding manner. So for example, an elephant, a typical male elephant rumble will be at 12 hertz. For humans, in a conversation, for the male, it will be about 110 hertz, and for the female conversation will be around 220 hertz. And bats, for example, vocalize 2 to 3 times higher than what a human can hear. And bats use echolocation, which is, in a nutshell, a sophisticated method of finding their food and navigating in the dark. And the bat vocalization can vary from 9 hertz to 200,000 hertz. So certain recorders might not actually be able to record bat sounds, and there's specialized recorders for that. And actually, the AudioMorph is able to capture the echolocations. So now we have a little bit of an idea of how the audio is digitally captured. Let's talk about the Hainan gibbons. So a passive acoustic monitoring project was set up in 2015. And so this was a fairly large collaboration with a number of researchers. And about 1.5 terabytes of data was collected, so roughly 6,000 hours of audio data. So 6,000 hours of soundscape data. And here the word soundscape refers to the multiple sources of sound that reach the recorder. And this term was actually coined in 1970 by a Canadian composer in his book titled The Soundscape, Our Sonic Environment and the Tuning of the World. So the question is, given that we have 6,000 hours of data, can we use machine learning to help find the vocalizations of the Hainan gibbon? Okay, so I mentioned that the data is digitally stored as a long sequence of numbers, but we can convert those sequence of numbers into spectrograms. And here are some examples of some spectrograms. So the Gibbon vocalization is made up of pulses. On the top left, there's an example of a 1-pulse call, then a 2-pulse call, a 3-pulse call, and they are, it goes a bit higher up to, I think the maximum I've seen was a 7-pulse call. And then there's the duet, which is when the male and female gibbon sing together. So actually what I would like to do is I would like to play some of these sounds for you. So I'm just going to exit this view. So maybe just reduce your volume. I'm going to increase my volume, and hopefully you can hear and see the spectrograms. So here you can see the 2-pulse call. There's another 2-pulse call, and this is the duet call. So I will play this now. Okay, so that was various 2-pulse calls followed by the duet call at the end. So hopefully you were able to hear that. Okay, so we've got our 6,000 hours of data. How does one even begin on such a project? So we can make use of software to visualize the spectrograms and to hear the sounds at the same time. So essentially exactly what I just did. And in this case, we used Sonic Visualizer, which is an open source software. And what we did is we randomly selected 32 files, and each of those 32 files was 8 hours long. So we manually sat down, put on a pair of headphones, and visualized the spectrogram and listen at the same time. And then we annotate the data by drawing little boxes around the gibbon calls. And then we also spend some time in labeling non-gibbon call events. So essentially, we manually annotated 32 files in order to allow us to train the machine learning algorithm to distinguish this and essentially not require us to manually go through 6,000 hours of data, which is highly just infeasible. And of course, this was a 6-month project. One can only imagine the amount of data they would obtain if they did this over 2 years, for example. Okay, so now we are ready to create our data set. We can extract the gibbon presence or gibbon absence. So once the data is manually annotated, we were able to create a data set which contains 2 classes to train the machine learning algorithm. One class for audio segments which contain gibbon presence, and the second class which had audio segments which had an absence of gibbon calls. And the absence class is actually quite important. And the absence class typically will contain 3 types of sounds. One is biophony, geophony, and anthropophony. So these terms were coined in 1987 by Bernie Krause as an attempt to describe the complex arrangement of biological sounds. Geophony sounds refer to non-biological natural sounds produced in any given habitat, like wind in the trees, water in a stream, waves at the ocean shore. Biophony refers to sounds produced by all living organisms in the habitat, such as bird calls, and anthropophony refers to sounds that humans produce, for example, music, laughter, and language. And these three types of sounds are essential in the absence class, as the more data that is available in this particular class, the model is less likely to produce false positives. And false positives is a big issue in the space of ecology because examining a false positive is time consuming. And if we have 6,000 hours of data, we don't want to have 300,000 of seconds of false positives, because then it is counterintuitive and we're wasting a lot of time. So a lot of effort should be spent on not only just the presence of what you're interested in, but also the absence within the soundscape of the environment. Okay, so in a nutshell, these are all the steps that are taken. So we will deploy the passive acoustic recorder in a non-invasive manner, capture the digital signals, and the digital signals are then converted to spectrograms via a Fourier transform. And then we use machine learning models to classify the data. Now, there's a number of machine learning algorithms that one could use. And in this case, we used deep neural networks because they are the state of the art in audio classification problems, specifically speech recognition. So it was naturally a good idea to also make use of deep learning, which is what we did. Okay, so that was a little bit about the project on the critically endangered Hainan gibbon. I'll talk about a few other projects that I'm working on. So the one is a species from Madagascar, which is the black and white ruffed lemur, which is also a critically endangered species. Here, data was collected by Carly, and Carly is from the City University of New York's Graduate Center. We manually annotated 115 files. So on the left is a picture of a black and white ruffed lemur, and here is the spectrogram of the lemur calls. And in this case, the calls are referred to as roars. So these ones are not particularly loud roars, so the signal is a bit faint, but it gives you a bit of an idea of what they look like. So just a fun note, when we were annotating this data and then ran it through the machine learning algorithm, the algorithm was able to find calls that we actually missed as human annotators because the call was too faint, for example. So it's quite funny how you spend time annotating the data and then the algorithm essentially says, oh, but you actually missed a whole bunch of stuff within your process of annotating your data, which is an encouraging result, essentially. The other project that I'm helping with is in a collaboration with a team in Malawi. And here we are monitoring the Thyolo-alethe, which is a bird endemic in Malawi, and it is classified as a vulnerable species. Here, 69 files were manually annotated. In addition to that, there were a number of files that were actively obtained via a directional microphone. The 69 files were obtained via audio muffs. And just another fun story here, it was faster to transfer the data via a courier than it was to upload the data, given the internet connection issues in some of these places. So actually, this is the first time in my life that I was hand-delivered a data set via a courier. And so this is a collaboration with a number of individuals. And here is the spectrogram for the Thyolo-alethe call. And the call is quite similar. There's not a lot of variations in the call. And the last project that I briefly want to mention is a collaboration with a number of individuals from Botswana. Here we are monitoring the spotted hyena, which is classified as a least concerned. And this is an interesting project. In this case, we started off with only 12 files being manually annotated. And I think these were potentially either 20-minute or 40-minute files. They were not very long. And we actually had very few recordings of the hyena. And using different machine learning approaches, we were able to create models that could assist in going through a large volume of data to find new hyena calls. And in this iterative manner, we were able to slowly improve the model by incorporating the newly found calls and making the model more and more robust. So here is at the bottom an example of the spotted hyena vocalization. And this is one of the many vocalizations that the hyena makes. This one's called the whoop call. Okay, so we spoke quite a bit about answering machine learning for classification in the context of ecology. Let's talk about machine learning and object detection and what kind of ecological questions we could answer. So the one type of question we could answer is how many individuals of the species were present over a period of time. So remember, in object detection, we can count things. So if we have cameras that are deployed, we can take pictures, we can identify the species and start counting them. So we can find out how many species were present over a period of time. And then we can also ask if the population size in a particular area might be changing. Of course, if this is done via audio or images, one has to take into consideration that the camera might miss the species or that the species might not vocalize next to the microphone, but it still can help us to start to understand population changes in particular areas. And this is important for critically endangered species where the population size might be really small. So keeping up-to-date knowledge as to the habitats of the few remaining individuals is an important thing to be aware of. And we can also answer questions like how much prey is the species encountering by counting the amount of prey that is visually in front of a particular species. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I want to just put a bit of a spotlight on some of the work done by students that I'm supervising or co-supervising. In this case, it's an object detection study by Alex, who's a master's student at UCT. And his thesis is titled Investigating Automated Bird Detection from Webcams Using Machine Learning. And in this project, the idea was that one can easily or relatively easily deploy camera traps, webcams. Some nature reserves already have webcams. Can we then do studies on the birds that are present in front of the webcam or the camera? So here in this image, you can see that the classifier, well, the object detector was able to correctly find the two birds in this picture. And in more complex settings, like in the top image, where there's a lot of other things going on, it was able to find the bird in the picture here. And the bottom image is also fairly a complex setting, and the detector was able to find the three birds here. So now let's think about the effort that would be required for a human to go through multiple webcams or camera traps. This would this would essentially take a tremendous amount of human effort, or a team of researchers would essentially need to be trained to recognize some of the species. So by using object detection, this approach can save researchers an incredible amount of man hours and cost, training people to go through this data and the human errors. When one is tired, they most likely will make mistakes, whereas these classifiers are not prone to those type of mistakes. And this allows us essentially to deploy multiple cameras to conduct large surveys. So at a nutshell, it significantly reduces the effort required. And one can also think, well, what about the mistakes that the algorithm makes? The algorithm is, depending on the data that it's been trained on, will most likely make some mistakes, some false negatives and some false positives. But in comparison to the amount of hours within the original data, the time reduction is quite significant. So here is another project by two master students at UCT, Temweka and Nikita. So I'm co-supervising with Ian, and the one's titled Detection, Isolation of Prey, Capture Events in Animal-Borne Images, and the other one, Counting Objects in Ecological Images Using Deep Learning. Now, in this case, what we're interested in is detecting the prey of the penguin and to be able to count the amount of prey that the penguin is encountering. And by counting the amount of jellyfish that the penguin is consuming, it will allow researchers to help calculate the calorie intake, so how much prey it has consumed, and also the amount of energy expended via foraging to find the prey. So at the bottom left is the object detector, which correctly classified this as a jellyfish. And so these are images from a video, so it looks slightly blurry. So this is essentially one frame from perhaps a 30 frame rate camera. And in this one, we can see that the detector is able to find and count the amount of prey that the penguin has encountered. So these are really useful to help to have an idea of energy intake and energy expended for these penguins. And here are some more images. On the left, it's correctly classified these preys. At the top right, it was able to correctly see that the penguin was just about to capture the fish, and at the bottom right, that the model was correctly able to count the amount of prey that the penguin captured. Now, of course, I've shown you really great images where the model does really well. Like with all machine learning projects, it's not always the case that the model will do amazingly well, but I'm just highlighting some of the interesting results. Okay, so now here's another question. Can we produce good and robust models if we have very little data? Now, why would we be interested in very little data? Well, if we're thinking about endangered species, we might not be able to obtain a lot of data because they're critically endangered, so the population size might be small. Or it might just be that the terrain is difficult to access and one is not able to survey correctly or deploy the camera traps or the microphones because the terrain is too difficult to access. So thinking about machine learning in ecology and very little data is a good problem to think about. So here I have two students, Boris and Eme, from the University of Rwanda, who have been exploring variations within machine learning techniques on soundscape data collected in Cape Town, actually at the Antaka Island Nature Reserve, to get around this particular problem. And I won't go into the details, but one of them is data augmentation, where we have data, so our spectrogram that contains the vocalization, in this case of a particular bird, and we can create synthetic data by just shifting the data in time. And if we shift the data in time, then we create synthetic but also realistic data. So these are just some small tricks that one can be inspired via the computer vision community and apply them to ecology to get around some of these issues regarding very little data. Okay, so and another reason for thinking about little data is that annotating and creating these data sets itself is actually a very time-consuming process. So being able to build models as quickly as possible with very little data is a useful thing. So this is a plot with the performance on the y-axis and two models. Here, so this is a research by Ian and myself, where we were trying to see if we could produce robust models on very little vocalization events. So this plot shows the performance on as few as 50 calls. We trained our deep neural networks with only 50 calls via transfer learning. And on the left, we have the performance via transfer learning. And on the right, we have multiple randomly created deep neural networks. And for this particular species, the transfer learning approach outperformed just creating a bunch of random deep learning models. Now, of course, I'm showing you a good result. This result is not always consistent, but across several data sets, we're seeing that this result is occurring, which is very interesting in the context of Africa, where we might not have access to as much computational power as institutions in different countries, and especially in other African countries, one might not have access to a lot of GPUs, which is where we train these deep learning models. So being able to produce models via transfer learning reduces this computational complexity. And we were also able to find that we were able to do this on computers with extremely limited resources. So these are highly encouraging results that we're working on, and we're hoping that this will help researchers where the data might be limited, but the resources for building the machine learning algorithms might also be limited. So what is my particular take on where all of this is going? So by training, I'm not a conservation ecologist, I'm a computer scientist. So this is, I guess, a computer scientist's view on this topic. And I believe that the future of the combination of these two fields is in real-time analysis of soundscape data. And two things are required to really succeed in this space. One is efforts are needed to create simpler deep learning models so that they can run on very limited hardware. So here's an example of a Raspberry Pi that is fairly limited hardware. So we would like to be able to put the models on these extremely limited hardware that can run on batteries to do real-time analysis. But the other thing we need to think about is the ability and more research to compress data. If we deploy these little devices in certain remote areas, we might not have 4G or 3G networks. We might have to use a different mean of data transfer. And one might need to look into data compression techniques for example, using remote compressing, remote sensing as a means of compressing data for ease of data transfer. So this is where I believe that things are probably heading, and some people have produced these type of devices already. I'm also working on this privately, and well, in our nonprofit we call this Project Lalela, and Lalela is just the Zulu word for listen. And at the bottom you can see a even more limited version of this device, and we're testing it out in the garden to see if it can automatically detect the bird calls. So I wanted to mention that a lot of the collaborations that I've discussed in this talk actually originated from a single tweet. So Mark Hidden and I co-founded EdgeAcoustics with the aim of trying to help ecologists build machine learning models. And from this single tweet, we were actually able to build quite a nice collaborative network and start to assist people. And I think that ecologists, mathematicians, machine learning researchers, and statisticians can all actually play a significant role to assist in conservation ecology. So the take-home message from this talk is, or at least in my opinion, is that by combining efforts, researchers from various disciplines can make significant impacts in conservation ecology. I also think that research should not end at a journal. Once the journal article has been published, I think that implementation and real-world action of taking these models and trying to deploy it in the field is a good action to take. And by engaging with policymakers to explain the technology and to help fund implementations of these projects is essential for immediate conservation action. And I also think that everyone can help. Everyone can help in a small way by just using their cell phone and recording data, for example, and just uploading the vocalization of birds or other animals to websites like Xenocanto, which focuses on birds, for example. Here in Cape Town, the grey heron is a fairly common, relatively common species. And when I looked on Xenocanto, there were actually very few. I think there were only 5 recordings in South Africa of the grey heron. So I just took my microphone and I recorded a few and uploaded the data. And now researchers can use this data. So I think that everyone in some way or another can assist in machine learning for acoustic ecology to help us create better models. And on that note, thank you very much. And we're now open for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmanuel, for, for a fascinating talk that opened up, at least to me, a complete new world. Yeah, no, thank you very much. We have a question in the Q&A, but I will allow, okay, he left. I wanted to give him the right to pose his question personally, but I don't see him anymore. Okay, the question was by Kanchu Rajaratnam, who is also based in Stellenbosch. This is very interesting. How many calls do you need to train one of your typical models? And please, I would like to encourage the speaker, the participants to ask questions. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So obviously, in the world of deep learning, the more is the better. So we would love to say, 1 million calls, but in practice, this is not possible. So the current research by Ian and myself is to try and examine the effects of very few calls. So we went as few as 25 calls, and we were able to produce competitive models. So more would be better, but if you have very little, I think that using modern modifications of deep learning and newly proposed techniques such as few-shot learning will allow researchers to create somewhat robust models with very, very little data. And this is particularly what I'm interested in, because in the context of Africa, I think that these are issues that are quite important. So it's hard to pinpoint a number, but we can do something with small numbers.
Okay, well, I think that was the sense of the question, just to have an order of magnitude. If it's 10 or 1,000, that makes a difference. Before I ask Hercules to ask his question, there is a question that ended up in the chat, which is the training data set for video classification made of photographs or from images of video recordings? This is just probably a technicality.
So it's frames extracted from the video.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. And now, Hercules, we gave you the right to speak. You're welcome to share your question with us and the speaker.
Thank you so much, professors. Thank you so much for the talk. It was an incredible use case and very exciting work that you're doing and dealing with. I have two questions. One is more fundamentally rooted in the nature of the work that you're doing. So have you come across, you mentioned this in the last part of your talk about transfer learning, but have you come across homologous relationships between different data sets of different species of animals where the structure or the general structure of it was similar enough that you could use different training sets for different test sets in different contexts? So that's my first question. And my second question is, this is obviously a very complicated thing, but have you triangulated or combined the information from audio and visual at the same time to try and see if you can gain even more in-depth insight into the automated recording as well as the labeling in real time? Thank you.
Great, great questions. So for the second question, I personally have not worked on this. I'm very interested in the acoustic side, so let's just say it's become a passion for me. But there are people working on this. There are people working on trying to have small camera traps where a Raspberry Pi will be embedded to do both the visual and audio component at the same time. So people are working on this. I don't know if there is an off-the-shelf thing that you can buy that does it right now, but people are working on this. For the first question, I have not encountered such data sets, but it wouldn't surprise me if one could do this. So something that I'm interested in is, since there are different classifications within the order of animals, so there's the kingdom and the order and the genus and the species, can one train data at a higher level of the species? So let's just make a really bad example. So train on all bird calls to then fine tune on the specific species, or train on all of the genus and then fine tune on the particular species. So I think these are all avenues that are open to exploration at this point in time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now there is a question by Idris, and you're welcome to unmute yourself and pose your question.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. My name is Idris, and I'm a PhD student in industrial engineering. So my question is this, it has to do with the algorithm that you use in building your models. So the question is, have you tried using the traditional ML algorithms? I mean, because sometimes when we go straight to using deep learning models, the traditional algorithm seems to perform better. So being a practitioner, what is going to be your advice in terms of choosing between going with traditional ML algorithm rather than going with deep learning models, in building your machine learning models?
Great question. So depending on the type of problem that you're addressing, simplicity first. So if you are dealing with a particular machine learning problem one might encourage decision trees, logistic regression, simple artificial neural networks. But in the context of audio classification, the current state of the art is deep neural networks, because the idea with deep learning is that the algorithm can learn visual features. We don't have to manually hard code these visual features that we're looking for. So in the context of recognizing visual cores within a spectrogram, deep learning is the state of the art. And I suspect that traditional machine learning techniques will not be able to perform as well. Of course, people have done this in the past prior to the hype in deep learning. And I'm sure one can easily find a paper which has compared these techniques, for which CNNs would have outperformed the traditional methods in this particular use case. So in different use cases, that might not be the case.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And we have one more question by Linley Nadesan. Linley, thank you for joining us, and you're welcome to, okay, you're already unmuted. You're welcome to ask your question.
Thank you, Francesco. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, clearly.
Okay, I just wanted to know, it may have escaped me. I recall during the presentation, you had a camera that was tied on the tree. And you mentioned that towards the end, you will say something about that camera. So I just wonder if you have done that, or
no, I have not.
Escaped it.
So it wasn't. So thanks for the reminder. So it's not a camera. It's an acoustic recorder, and this is the waterproof box, because of course we want it to be waterproof. And if we open the box, we have the device. So here is the place for your 3 batteries. And this is the actual device. So here's my hand, here's the device. So it's a very small acoustic recorder that can record up to 360,000 hertz, which means it can record bat echolocations. And it can last, if you're surveying typical frequencies, it can last 2 weeks, and then there's a little SD card in here that you can take out. So this is a really great way to monitor species in a non-invasive manner. So yeah, thanks for reminding me.
No, thank you. Thank you, Linley. Yeah. Okay, I think it seems we don't have any urgent questions. So Emmanuel, thank you so much. You saw from the large amount of questions and all the compliments that you received that your talk made an impact. Yeah, so thank you very much for that. And I'm sure we will make a plan to invite you again in the near future, so you can update us on this approach. And who knows, maybe some of the participants will reach out to you and will be interested in starting to work with you on some of these aspects. Yeah? And of course, I would be very curious to see if with quantum machine learning we can do something in the ecology.
Thank you so much.
But we will see. So as a last remark, just after the talk, we are planning to have our first NITheCS social event. You know, since a year and a half, we don't interact, and so we want to try something different tonight. I posted the link in the chat, and it should appear in your browser. Yeah. So join us, and we'll see how it goes. Yeah. So Emmanuel, thank you so much for the excellent talk. Ilya, thank you for joining us as usual, and thank you to all the participants. And I hope to see you in our social event just now, and otherwise next week at the next NITheCS Colloquium. Thank you very much. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.